All right, today I'd like to start out with, I did bring in a classic album of the week. This is an album by the Doobie Brothers from 1972. It's called Toulouse Street. And listen to the music. It's probably the song that if you've heard it, you heard the Doobie Brothers, you probably would have heard that song. And that's probably the best song on here. There's another song, Jesus Is Just All Right, that was pretty famous as well. So anyway, 1972 Doobie Brothers single album, cost me $2.84 back in 1972. So try taking a listen to that. So last time we were talking about the economics of crime, and we said that there was a sort of a paper that had been done looking at different states that had different methods of whether they had capital punishment or not. We're looking at the deterrence effect on murder. And in 1975, there was a famous paper by Isaac Ehrlich in the American Economic Review. In which he took a look at data from 1933 to 1969. And he found that there was a deterrent effect on capital punishment on homicide that was statistically significant. But he looked at a number of the things that we had been talking about that might affect your rational choice of crime, that is the probability of being arrested and the probability of being convicted once you're arrested, and the probability of execution, which is what is the F in terms of the F of X. And what he found was that in the order of deterrence, the order of the deterrence effect, so the first thing was that the increase in the probability of arrest. So if what you did was you increased the chances of the person being caught, which would say you might have more police out there and things of that sort. The second thing was the increase in the probability of conviction. And then the third thing was the increase in the probability of execution. And what he did was basically did a regression analysis. We've, of course, talked about problems with regression analysis if you've had any econometrics. But in particular, with this particular model, there was a bunch of papers that came out afterwards that basically were contradictory, or that pointed out that Ehrlich had these problems. And in particular, there was a paper that I'll talk about in a minute, but that came out and said, okay, look, here's why Ehrlich's model isn't accurate. Because this is the idea whether does the death penalty have an effect on homicides? And in particular, with this model, this is the issue of, this is the problems with the model. And one is functional form. Again, the things that we just referenced earlier when you were trying to get estimates of what things were more effective in deterring crime, like would you have more police, or did you have higher probabilities of conviction, or did you increase the F of X? And so the first thing was functional form. And it turns out that if you change the functional form, some of the papers that were in response to this, if you change the functional form, you change the result. With the argument being that his finding that the death penalty had an effect on homicide was due to the particular functional form that he used. The second thing is the second problem that people talked about was the issue of what's called multicollinearity. And the issue with multicollinearity is that are there explanatory variables that are correlated in the model? So if we had some y is equal to some a1 x1 plus a2 x2 plus da-da-da-da, if x1 and x2 are correlated, then what might be happening is the coefficient that you're picking up on x2, which might be probability of execution, that coefficient might be picking up what the effect of x1 is. And so if we sort of think about that, what we've talked about is a jury more likely to convict you if or put it this way, is a jury less likely to convict you if there's a really severe penalty? Like if there was, this issue about 3 strikes and you're out. So if the punishment is severe, then it might be that there's a correlation between the death penalty and the probability of conviction. In particular, we said that it might be that a jury might be less likely to convict you if there's a really severe penalty for what you've done. And so the argument in the against Ehrlich's result was that what Ehrlich was picking up in the effect of the death penalty on execution was really coming from the probability of conviction or one of the other variables that might be related to that. In fact, there was a 1981 Michigan Law Review paper, just interesting. In the 1981 Michigan Law Review, there was a paper that found that using Ehrlich's data on an increase in the use of execution does reduce the probability of conviction, just what we were talking about. That is, they looked at the data and they said, there is this correlation between the death penalty and the probability of conviction. And in particular, that would say that Ehrlich's model is picking up as the effect of the execution is really a biased estimate in that it really should be 0. And then just a final point was the results depend on the time period. And that was just that John Taylor did a study where when they left out the variables 1962 to 69, if you leave out 62 to 69, then you get no effect. Using his same model, you get no effect of the death penalty on execution. So the bottom line is the empirical evidence on the effect of the death penalty on execution is certainly not clear. And so if that's the case, right, so it's not clear, right, that there's an effect of the death penalty on murders. right? I mean, that's sort of, you know, we're trying to reduce murders, which have a high social cost to them. And the question then is this death penalty have a strong effect? So one is, just sort of thinking through this, you have uncertain benefits. And if you have uncertain benefits, you have a couple other things that are going on the cost side. One is, it turns out there's a high administrative cost. It's a high administrative cost to trial when you have a death penalty. There's in the text to talk about it, but basically there's a lot of things that are required in a death penalty trial that make it expensive to put that trial on. The other thing is that if you have the error costs are high, right? That is, if we have this is the type 1 and type 2 error. The error costs are high if you convict someone when they're not guilty, and we've already talked about this. If you convict them of a, you know, we've talked about this before, but, you know, if what happens is you're sentenced to life in prison and then 10 years later we find out that through DNA evidence that you really didn't commit the crime, then that error cost is not as high as if we executed you and then we find out 10 years later that you really didn't commit it. A last point is there are not very many actual data points, right? There are a few data points here. We don't convict a lot of people and execute them. So without a lot of data points, then these empirical models might be are hard to get statistically significant results. So as we've seen before, there was a decline in the number of states allowing this and restrictions in other states. So you can see that over time we're probably going to see less use of the death penalty. Joe Biden has said that he will work to end the use of capital punishment by the federal government. Actually, it's interesting, the Trump administration, there was a 17-year gap or hiatus from the use of the death penalty, and the Trump administration has been using it. This summer, they've executed 8 people, and 2 more are scheduled before the end of the year. So there is going to be this debate over whether the death penalty is something that we ought to be doing. All right. So that leads us to another topic in criminal law, and it's an interesting topic as well, and that is the topic of drugs. Drugs and crime. In 1927, again, those of you who had Econ 105, and 1927, Ludwig von Mises wrote a book called Liberalism. And if you haven't read it, you really ought to read it. It's a short little book, very interesting. And I mean, there's a number of things that happen in that book. In 1927, he predicts that, remember this is the Roaring '20s, he predicts they're going to have the Great Depression. He predicts that we're going to have World War II. He predicts that the fascists are going to start World War II. But from our perspective right here is it's written during Prohibition. And what he says is that using the government to keep people from consuming a product, A, is not likely to work, and B is going to open up a Pandora's box of unintended consequences. So I'm going to read from his book, Foundations of Liberal Policy, is the section within liberal policy, the chapter called Foundations of Liberal Policy. And he says, the question whether even a small quantity of alcohol, remember this is written during the Prohibition, he says, the question of whether even a small quantity of alcohol is harmful or whether the harm results only from the abuse of alcoholic beverages is not at issue here. It is an established fact that alcoholism, cocainism, and morphinism are deadly enemies of life, of health, and of the capacity for work and enjoyment, and a utilitarian must therefore consider them as vices. But this is far from demonstrating that the authorities must interpose to suppress these vices by commercial prohibitions, nor is it by any means evident that such intervention on the part of the government is really capable of suppressing them, or that even if this end could be attained, it might not therewith open up a Pandora's box of other dangers, no less mischievous than alcoholism and morphinism. Whoever is convinced that indulgence or excessive indulgence in these poisons is pernicious is not hindered from living abstemiously or temperately. The question cannot be treated exclusively in reference to alcoholism, morphinism, cocainism, etc., which all reasonable men acknowledge to be evils. For if the majority of citizens is, in principle, conceded the right to impose its way of life upon a minority, it is impossible to stop at prohibitions against indulgence in alcohol, morphine, cocaine, and similar poisons. Why should not what is valid for these poisons be valid also for nicotine, caffeine, and the like? Well, interesting. Again, the alcohol was prohibited under the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment, this is for prohibition here. The 18th Amendment was ratified in January of 1919. And interesting enough, it was repealed in December of 1933. Now, it's pretty hard to pass an amendment that would repeal the other amendment to the Constitution. I mean, that's a pretty big deal to do that. And so again, Mises is sort of interesting that he's talking about this in 1927, and 6 years, the book's published, and 6 years later, we've gotten rid of the 18th Amendment. And so public policy then was reflecting what Mises had been talking about. That is, it wasn't working very well, right? I don't know if you watch the Untouchables, or if you have read about what was going on during Prohibition, right? The mafia was out there, and they had these speakeasies, and there was all sorts of underground behavior going on, and so people were still consuming alcohol, but it was just being done illegally. So let's just take a look at this in terms of drugs, and think about whether this ought to be criminal behavior or not. Right? That's what we're talking about. Should this be a criminal behavior? So let's say that what public policy wants to reduce the consumption of drugs. Suppose that we said that, let's just take marijuana as an example, because there's been a lot of things going on with marijuana, so we'll talk about that in a moment. But suppose that let's say we're talking about marijuana, and we said, you know what? People who people consume marijuana, and it affects their judgment about criminal behavior. It affects their perception of what P of X is going to be, or affects their perception about what F of X is going to be. And so there's more crime if we have the use of marijuana. And so, you know, what we're going to do is we're going to try to make so that that's illegal itself, right? So let's go ahead and, again, for those of that who've had Econ 105, you know, you've seen this demonstration before, but let's just think about it for a moment. Suppose that what I want to do is, again, reduce the consumption of marijuana. And let's look at, we have a demand for marijuana and we have a supply of marijuana. And here's our equilibrium price and quantity. We'll call it P1 and Q1. And the way we do that is we say we're going to restrict the supply of drugs. We're going to arrest people who are selling drugs. If we find marijuana fields out there, we will wipe them out. You know, we'll seize the marijuana crop or whatever. And so what we do is we're going to try to shift the supply. We're going to shift the supply to the left, right? So we undertake behaviors from a public policy perspective that's going to shift that supply curve to the left. Now, indeed, if we do that, we'll go to a reduced quantity, right? Q goes down from, right, Q1 to Q2. But notice also that P goes up from P1 to P2. Now suppose that in the relevant range here that this marijuana has inelastic demand, right? And what is inelastic demand? Remember that elasticity is less than 1, and that tells you that the percentage change in quantity is less than the percentage change in price. And so what did we have here? We had P going up and we had Q going down, but what does that imply? It says that P's going up more than Q's going down, and so P times Q, had to go up, right? So what does that tell you? A, that people who are selling it, right, the revenue will increase for those that are selling it, and consumers will spend more. So we have accomplished one thing, that we've reduced the quantity, but the problem that comes about is that we've increased the total amount being spent. But notice also that if what we did was by increasing the price, what have you done? By increasing the price, you've changed the demand for substitutes, all right? So by increasing the price, I've increased the demand for substitutes, right? Just think back to your principles of microeconomics, or again, Econ 105. What happens when I raise the price of oranges? People will buy more apples at the same price that they did before. We'll have shifted that demand curve to the right. And so what do we do here? What we've done here is we've increased the price of the substitute. So let's say that we have cocaine here, and we had a demand and supply for cocaine to start with. When I raised the price of marijuana, what did I do? I shifted the demand for cocaine to the right. And what's that going to what is that going to do? That is going to increase the it's going to increase the price of cocaine, and it's going to increase the total revenue for people that are doing that. And so what happens then? Well, what if what we do is we go out and we shift that supply curve to the left? We do the same thing, right? We go after the sale of cocaine. Well, one of the problems here then is I now have the same situation. What if Cocaine is, it has relatively inelastic demand. So now that we've gone here, now we're moving up there. Well, then what will happen is I will have people spending more on it. And then you can see that this keeps going. That is, now I have an incentive to be innovative in having a substitute for cocaine. So let's say we have crack cocaine, right? And then we have methamphetamine, and then we have crystallized methamphetamine, etc. Right? So that, notice that what you've done is you've set up a situation where you have this incentive to produce further substitutes. And if you think back to, if you just really think back to the what was going on in the war on drugs, and we'll talk more about that in just a second, is that perhaps what you might want to do is you might want to reduce the amount. Suppose that what you did was you said, hey, I want to reduce the amount of, going back to the marijuana, I want to reduce the amount of marijuana that's consumed, and I want to reduce the total amount that people spend on it. So let's go back to our demand and supply curve for marijuana. And I said, you know what? How can we make it so that how can we make it in this picture so that what happens is we do both? That is, if we want to reduce the amount that people spend on it, and we want to reduce Q. Well, again, you only got two curves here, demand and supply. How about if we shift the demand curve to the left? Right? If I were to shift the demand curve to the left, then what happens is price goes down, right? P goes down, Q goes down. That means P times Q went down. And I'm not increasing the price of a substitute, right? I'm reducing the price of a substitute, which would shift the demand for other things to the left. And so the question then is, how might one shift the demand curve to the left? Okay? Well, one of the ways that you shift the demand curve to the left is, one of the things that affects demand, right, is people's preferences. If I change their preferences for marijuana, then what I can do, then what will happen, when we look at it diagrammatically, every picture tells a story. If I change your preferences, so I'll buy less marijuana at the same price, then in order to change their preferences, how about if I advertise? Right? If I advertise, then what will happen is I will affect that demand curve, shifting it to the left. Okay? Now, the question is, how effective is that? Is it possible to advertise, and can we make it so that we can actually shift that demand curve to the left? Well, just think about, I always ask, how many out there smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day, right? Or how many even know anybody that smokes a pack of cigarettes a day? And very few people do that, right? But if this were 1958, lots of people would be raising their hand, right? And if we, it's interesting, go watch Turner Movie Classics and start looking at movies from the 1950s and what are you 1960s? Guess what? All the heroes, at some point during the movie, they're going to light up a cigarette, right? And the heroine is going to light up the cigarette. there were advertising on television. You'd see the Marlboro Man, who was a really cool guy, right? And so what we've done is we've managed to shift that demand curve for cigarettes to the left by advertising, right? I mean, if you ever looked at a package of cigarettes, it'll say, warning: the Surgeon General has, determined that, smoking this is going to kill you. It doesn't say it exactly that way, but that's the point here. And so we have very little advertising of cigarettes anymore, partly because there was a law that was passed that made it so you can't advertise cigarettes on television. But again, there's if you take my ECON 415 class or 105 class, we talk about from the game theory perspective about why that happened. But and just if you sort of think about it, you can make an argument that it was the cigarette companies that got that law passed because they found out that advertising on television did not increase the number of smokers, but it changed the amount that your company might get. So it changed market share, and so if you colluded, you could make it so that everybody would stop spending on advertising on television. They'd save that money, and the reason that they couldn't do that without a law is because of the prisoner's dilemma that we talked about, right? I have an incentive. Once you guys decide that you agree to not advertise, I should go out and advertise, right? Because I'll increase my market share. But if we got a law passed, it solved the prisoner's dilemma. But that's just as an aside here. But the point being is that if you want to reduce drug use, if that's a public policy thing that you want to do, you may be better off spending dollars advertising, having the Department of Health and Human Services or whatever, spending money advertising rather than spending money on making it a criminal offense and all the expenses that are entailed in that. Let's talk about a second point is it possible to suppress? Can you suppress or interdiction? That is it possible to make it so that people don't actually consume it? Which is what Mises was saying, right? He's saying that it's not going to work. Okay. Well, why would what's an argument here is that it's not truly feasible. That is, can we keep drugs coming in from other countries? Can we suppress the production of drugs here? I mean, clearly during Prohibition, it was impossible to suppress the making of alcohol within the United States, but also alcohol was coming in from Canada, and they weren't able to keep that from going on. And as we pointed out, that the 18th Amendment got repealed, and so what's been the history of what's going on is that even if we looked at the U.S. attempted to restrict production of drugs from Turkey and Mexico, so we've attempted. Just an observation, right? We attempted to restrict importation from Turkey, Mexico, and what happens? What happens is that, as you might expect, that other countries will import it. Right? Or there'll be different drugs. If there, again, just as looking at from an economist's point, if there's economic profit to be made from the sale of drugs, what will happen is there's going to be somebody who's going to step in if if what happens is I restrict, I'm somehow able to restrict the flow of drugs from Turkey, then somebody else is going to start trying to ship drugs in. In fact, today, one of the largest importers of drugs is China. And in particular, the fentanyl an opioid. And what is the big drug problem today? The big drug problem today is not, in terms of illegal drugs, is not really marijuana. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it's actually opioids, which fentanyl is. That's our major drug problem today. In fact, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, one of their latest report said that in drug overdose deaths in the United States rose 4.6% in 2019, okay, to 70,980. Right? You don't have to remember this, but that's a pretty big number. 70,980 drug overdose deaths in 2019 in the U.S. And of those, 50,042 were from opioids. So in terms of health consequences, what happens is the health consequences move because what happens is the drugs move. If we're able to effectively suppress a drug over here, as I said before, you'll change the demand for substitutes, et cetera, and you'll change the amount of money or profit being made in those other drugs. And it turns out that, again, opioids are the largest problem. There is a paper done in 2015 that I'm just going to read a quote from Ann Case and Angus Deaton. They wrote a paper in 2015 looking at this. And Angus Deaton won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2015. And he and his wife, Ann Case is his wife, they teach at Princeton. They've written a number of books on a number of things, but let me just read you what their paper in 2015 said. The increased availability of opioid prescriptions for pain that began in the late 1990s has been widely noted, as has the associated mortality. The CDC estimates that for each prescription painkiller death in 2008, there were 10 treatment admissions for abuse, 32 emergency department visits for misuse or abuse, 130 people who are abusers or dependent, and 825 non-medical users. Addictions are hard to treat and pain is hard to control, so those currently in midlife may be a lost generation whose future is less bright than those who preceded them. Well, there is a number of court cases going on with regard to companies that produce opioids in prescription for prescription use, and how So there's if you're interested, you might want to take a look at the civil case with the civil suit that's going on with regard to the use of prescription drugs, and it's again it's a very interesting topic. But the point here being that if you try to make a drug illegal, then you have this question about what's the benefits and the costs again. If we look at when did the war on drugs really start, President Nixon in 1970. In 1970, President Nixon started with the war on drugs. It was called the Controlled Substances Act. It was signed into law in 1970. And the attempt was to make it so that drug use was going to be criminalized. And what was the result? Has it been effective? Well, just a personal observation. I was at Berkeley between 1972 and 1976. That was when I was a graduate student there. And if there had been drugs out there, I would have seen them. But the only drug I ever saw in those 4 years was when this war on drugs was just starting to ramp up, was marijuana. And marijuana at the time had a THC content that was a little bit above oregano. Today, the THC content of marijuana is multiple times larger than it was in the 1970s when the war on drugs started. And there's all sorts of recreational pharmaceuticals out there that didn't exist, just as we were talking about and theoretically, if what I'm attempting to do is shift that supply curve to the left, what's going to happen is I'm going to have an incentive to have improved substitutes, et cetera. And so clearly this hasn't been an effective mechanism to reduce drug use within the United States. Again, there's a reasonable argument for the legalization of drugs that was similar to the arguments for the legalization of alcohol during Prohibition. Again, in the criminal law subfolder, in the 472 folder, there is a paper by Dan Mitchell that you might want to take a look at, where he has looked at a study of Portugal. There's his paper on how Portugal basically made it so all drugs are legal. And so you might want to just take a look at that. It's called on this decriminalization of drug use in Portugal and what the result was there. Just some additional comments. One is that again, by making the drugs illegal, you will increase the oligopoly profit. That is, you might not have just a monopoly, but what you're doing? By making them illegal, you're restricting the supply of people that are going to, Johnson & Johnson isn't going to produce marijuana if it's illegal to do that, right? But you'll have drug cartels that will do that. And what you've done is you've, again, increased the profits. And as an example, if you just look at what happened with the mafia during Prohibition, what you did was you made it so that they had a large revenue source that other people couldn't enter, or other firms couldn't enter. Normally when firms are making economic profit, other firms enter the industry. Well, you've created a barrier here to entry in that I don't want to be, if I'm, again, Johnson & Johnson, I'm not going to enter a market that is illegal. A second thing is that for legal drugs, what do you have? You have liability law, right? right? You have tort. I could be, if I am Johnson & Johnson and I sell a product that causes damage to you, you could sue me, right? And so if you have tort law, we talked about tort law. If you have tort law, then I'm going to be Johnson & Johnson. I'm going to be careful about the safety of those drugs, right? So under liability law on tort, you could sue me if I'm Johnson & Johnson. What's going to happen? I'm going to have an incentive to ensure the safety of the product. But if where you buy your marijuana is from the local guy on the street, what are you going to do if suppose that it's been laced with crystallized methamphetamine, or it has some sort of problem with it that causes you lung damage, right? What are you going to do? You can't sue them. So that if you have illegal drugs, there's certainly less incentive to ensure the safety of the product. Whereas, like I said, if Johnson & Johnson were selling marijuana, then they'd have to be, they could be sued if it caused harm to you. So they're going to look over the manufacturer of it and try to ensure the safety of it. A third thing is, what do you do about criminal theft, right, or fraud? You go to buy some marijuana from somebody out on the street, and what happens is they just steal your money, right? What do? Do you go to the police and say, hey, I was trying to buy this illegal drug from this person, and they took my money and they didn't deliver the drugs, right? That's not going to happen. And so you get other criminal activity that's going on because of this inability to have basically proper contracts in the sale of marijuana or sale of whatever drug you've made illegal. And so that leads us to a discussion about marijuana in particular. We'll just talk here for a moment or two, and then we'll next lecture we'll finish this up. But interestingly enough about marijuana, because there's a conflict between federal and state laws. There's a conflict between federal and state law. And it's an interesting conflict. It's illegal under federal law. The use and possession of marijuana is illegal under federal law. It's called a Schedule I drug, right? So possession, sale, use, etc. It's illegal under federal law as a Schedule I drug. However, 35 states have passed laws making medical marijuana a legal drug, right? So you have 35 states that have made medical marijuana legal in that state. And in addition, we have 15 states that have recreational use of marijuana legal. Recreational use is legal. So I got this conflict that says, you know what? possession and sale of marijuana is illegal under federal law, but it's legal in the state of Michigan, for example. In particular, Michigan in 2008, they made medical marijuana legal, and just recently, or relatively recently, Michigan in 2018, they became one of the 15 states that if you have recreational use is legal. So how does that work, right? It's sort of, again, it's an interesting anomaly that doesn't exist in many instances where something's illegal under federal law, but your state makes it legal to do. In fact, since 2014, there's been and since 2014, there's a budget amendment when the federal government passes its budget. Under the federal government's budget amendment, precludes the Department of Justice, precludes the DOJ, Department of Justice, from using funds to prosecute conduct that's in compliance with state medical marijuana laws. Okay? So there's a budget amendment that precludes DOJ from using funds to prosecute people or to investigate conduct that is in compliance with a state law, to use funds to deal with medical marijuana that's in compliance with the state law. And so you have this situation where, yeah, the federal law makes it that it's illegal to possess marijuana, but I've got a budget amendment every year that says that, since 2014, that says, you know what, the Department of Justice, you can't use funds to prosecute conduct that's in compliance with a state law on medical marijuana. It recently, in the last budget, it passed as well. So that, again, very interesting situation. So what we'll talk about next time is basically what we've talked about many times, is thinking about the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost of criminalization of drugs. And then what we'll do is we're going to move on to take a look at the topic of civil asset forfeiture.